Welcome back. Edward Snowden's revelations have raised a lot of questions. How do democratic nations deal with threats to their safety if they're to prevent a repeat of the 9/11 attacks, the London bombings, or the Mumbai attacks? Can they do so without infringing on civil liberties? Joining me now from New York is Ryan Mauro, National Security Advisor at the Clarion Project, an organization that studies Islamic extremism. And with me here in the studio is Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Gentlemen, welcome to the both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a look at that broad question. Does the national security interest of the state trump privacy interest, constitutional rights of its citizens? Ryan Mauro, you first.
Well, I think there is always that balance between keeping your citizens safe and also between protecting civil liberties. But I must say the headlines are a bit misleading about the Snowden revelations. This is the type of activity that I've assumed is going on for quite some time. Many people would assume so. And America is not a surveillance society. There's no one listening in when you have a fight with your girlfriend on the phone. And so I think that the headlines are very exaggerated.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me ask Ivan Eland. The administration and the one before it says that it's facing an unprecedented threat, the threat from terrorists. In order to protect U.S. citizens, we have to give up those rights.
Well, it's not an unprecedented threat, and actually it's not an existential threat, even after 9/11. I mean, the average American's chances of being killed by a terrorist of any sort is about 1 in 80,000, which is about the chances of getting hit by an asteroid. So I think we have to put this in, obviously the government has to do something about it, but I think we need to put it in perspective. And I think this phone program really goes against the Republic. They're not listening in to conversations yet. They have the potential to do so. The president even said just recently that there's a tremendous potential for abuse in this domestic phone. They have all these phone records. And, they get a lot nowadays with new technology with what they call traffic analysis, just getting phone patterns without looking at the content at all. So I think you have to distinguish between the two programs, and I think this domestic logging of domestic calls is very, very insidious for the Republic.
Okay, Ryan, what about that? There is a potential here for abuse. You know, this has happened in the past. I mean, how far are we away from doing what J. Edgar Hoover did when he monitored?
Well, I think that the debate needs to focus on if you have an idea on how to improve the civil liberties protections without sacrificing the program, then have that discussion. That's perfectly fine. But it shouldn't be a discussion about whether the programs exist at all, because they make a lot of sense. For example, with the phone records, imagine that we seize an Al-Qaeda member's cell phone from overseas, and then we want to find out who called him. The way you would do that with this database is you plug in the phone number into the database, you do a search, and then you can find out which Americans were calling this Al-Qaeda member. That's information that I want to know. And then from there, if you want to wiretap someone, you still have to go through the FISA court and get a warrant for that. So it's not like there's no oversight at all. Is there potential for abuse? There always is whenever you have any type of government program. But the way to go about this, if you know of abuse, is not to just leak classified information because in your opinion you feel it should be out there. You can go to the House or the Senate Intelligence Committees and you'll find politicians that would love to get in front of the cameras and reveal that and say, look, I exposed this abuse.
Okay, let me get to your first point with Ivan. Point he was making there. What's the alternative?
The alternative is following the Constitution, and this is blatantly unconstitutional. You don't have to look at the content of someone's emails or listening into their phone calls for it to be a search. The Constitution requires that there's probable cause that a crime has been committed, and it also says there's no general searches. You have to be very specific, and they put that in there because the British military, when the U.S. was colonies of the British, they would use general searches to go on a fishing expedition. And having all this data allows the U.S. government to do the same thing, which we complained about the British doing. And I think that is a search.
Right. I mean, one has to look at how efficient this is, how this program works, and what it does exactly. Ryan, I mean, if we look at it, this has been going on for some time, yet all this surveillance couldn't stop the Boston bombers carrying out their attack.
That's true, and that's just part of living in a democracy, that you do have all of these vulnerable targets and you're not going to be able to stop them all. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try with reasonable programs that have adequate oversight, as I believe these programs did. General Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA and the former director of the NSA, gave the example that there were phone calls being made from 2 of the hijackers in San Diego to an Al-Qaeda safe house overseas. Now, because they didn't have that program, they weren't able to find out who was calling that Al-Qaeda safe house. Today, what they could do is they could see who was calling that safe house, see it's 2 individuals in San Diego, conduct an investigation, and they could have potentially thwarted the plot.
But some of what the government is telling us is a little bit misleading. Even what the president is telling us is a little bit misleading, because when you say that we're not actually listening into the content of telephone calls, that's not entirely true. The FISA requirements only apply to those parties that are within the United States. Those are domestic telephone calls or domestic communications. If one of the targeted parties is outside the country, then that FISA requirement doesn't apply at all. They can listen into content, they can look at it, they can read it.
Sure, because if you're zeroing in on a foreign suspect and you're listening to his phone
yes,
calls
but it
and
is
then
also
American
affecting
calls,
the party
you're going to pick that up.
Right, it's also affecting the party within the United States. That's a US citizen who is now having his telephone calls or his internet listened to or read.
Right, and anything that's improperly obtained from an American has to be destroyed. That's according to what the officials are saying. And so I just think that the headlines are just massively blowing this out of proportion. And by the way, the PRISM program is aimed at foreigners, and foreigners do not have the constitutional protections of American citizens, obviously.
Yes, but the PRISM program can operate without a warrant, and that, in my mind, is unconstitutional. And the original intent of this was to protect people's privacy and their personal property from British searches. So it doesn't just apply to your personal property when they search it, and we've never interpreted it that way. But the phone log program is just off the deep end. I mean, you're collecting phone records, which is a search of all Americans. And Dianne Feinstein, I thought, made the most foolish comment when she said, well, we need these records because any American could become a future terrorist. And I suppose that's technically true, but I mean, most people are law-abiding citizens, probably 99.9999% of them are, and this is just outrageous in a republic. And the government has this data, and there's a lot of potential for abuse, and President Obama even said that himself.
Ryan, is that true, that every American is potentially a terrorist? And that justifies keeping their records?
It's technically true, but I agree that that is a stupid and embarrassing thing to say, and that does cause the whole slippery slope argument to gain some traction. But I just don't see that the private property, I do not own Verizon's records of who I called and when I called. And so when you're saying that it's personal property that's being searched, it's just not true. And in terms of probable cause, for decades now, the cops and law enforcement has gotten those type of records from phone companies in order to establish probable cause. So this actually isn't that surprising.
But
they have to establish probable cause before they can get a warrant from the judge. And there's no warrant in the case of these phone logs that were taken, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, but my question is, if you are sweeping up the records of everybody, how do you establish probable cause? That means everybody's suspicious?
Well, the court, that's another problem, is a secret court. Yeah. I don't know how they can read the Fourth Amendment and grant that, because it is a general search, and you need a specific search, and you need probable cause that a crime has been committed.
Right. Ryan, isn't it a little bit farcical to say that the authorities are trying to establish probable cause when they're sweeping up everybody in these intelligence gatherings, and also, it seems like they're just going on a fishing expedition here. They don't have any reason to do it. They're just hoping that something will turn up.
Well, former prosecutor Andrew McCarthy just wrote a really fantastic article on this topic about the Fourth Amendment, where he said he cited a Supreme Court ruling, or actually something that Justice Scalia said last year on this issue, saying that the Fourth Amendment is referring to personal property, and that cannot be searched. But if you're putting your information in the hands of a third party, a telecommunications company, and the government wants to access that without even being able to identify you, especially not the content of the conversations, then there really is no problem with that. And by the way, it's not like they're saying this is saying who is calling who specifically. It's what number is calling what number, and then you go and you search through it once you find a suspect's number. So it's not like they're just going through all of the numbers and just checking on random people.
Well, the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution says you have rights which are not listed in the Bill of Rights. And it's very interesting that conservatives are taking the position that there's no right of privacy because, and they do this with abortion as well, because you should have a right to privacy. And the Constitution doesn't say personal property. It talks about searches.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen.
Well, I'm saying Justice Scalia did interpret it that way. I'm not aware of any court decision that interpreted the way that you're describing. So
well, the
it's
courts
not
are
as clear
the
cut as
problem.
you're saying.
The courts are the problem. Let's stick with the Constitution. If you're conservative, let's stick with the letter of the Constitution.
Well, first of all, I don't identify myself as a conservative, and secondly,
well,
I'm just
Scalia
saying the people that are actually
Scalia
judges, which you are not, are saying that this is referring to personal property. And so therefore, the information that you voluntarily put in the hands of a business that you're buying a service from, like a telecommunications property, is not your property, especially when it does not identify you by name.
The judges need to start reading the Constitution. If you pull out the Constitution, it's very clear, and you can make all sorts of court decisions if you want, but we need to get back to looking at the Constitution and following what it says, because the federal government is way off the rails on many areas of the Constitution, and this is one of them.
Okay, Ryan, I'm going to give you the last word.
Sure, well, it's fine to have that opinion, but again, I would say that if you have those concerns, the conversation should be on how to have proper oversight, not about scrapping the programs altogether, because it makes sense for the NSA to want to be able to find out who is calling terrorists once they have a terrorist phone number. This is all very reasonable to me.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. Ryan Mauro in New York, Ivan Eland here in Washington. Thank you.